afternoon. My name is Matt Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the Woodstock History Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Louise Vivanco. And we'll be discussing the early history of bicycling in Vermont and its impact on roads, the perception of travel, gender roles, and more. Louise is a cultural anthropologist and co-director of UVM's Humanities Center. He holds a bachelor's degree in religion from Dartmouth College and a master's and PhD in cultural anthropology from Princeton University. Today's program, which is entitled Of Wheelmen, The New Woman and Good Roads, Bicycling in Vermont 1880 to 1920, is sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council. As always, we'd like to thank the Vermont Humanities Council for all they do to support nonprofits like the Woodstock History Center by sponsoring public talks, book discussions, and a wide array of literacy programs and humanity events. There are on the chairs the questionnaires for the Vermont Humanities Council. I noticed there's a new online survey. They appreciate the feedback that you give about their speakers, and it helps guide their decisions in the future. And we also like to thank Woodstock Community Television, who's obviously in the back of the room. We appreciate them taping events like the one we're doing today. We also just want to thank you guys for joining us today. It's a nice day out, so we appreciate anyone coming out. And if you'd just like to welcome our guest, Louise Vivanco.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it, and I don't blame the others who are probably out for a bike ride. I got my bike ride in this morning. So, well, thank you all very much for being here. I am very pleased to be in a substantial home, historic home of wheeling activity here in Vermont. Been wanting to do more research here in Woodstock, and so this opportunity to speak here was a little bit of an opportunity to dig around a little bit more. But there's still so much more to do. So what I'm going to do is give you kind of an overview of the history of bicycling between 1880 and 1920. And for me, so I'm a cultural anthropologist, you heard this, and so for me, I study social movements. I've been spending the last better part of 25 years studying environmentalists in Latin America. And something like 8-9 years ago, my everyday activity and love of riding bicycles suddenly was reframed for me as a green activity. I hadn't largely, that was not how I always understood it. It was the pleasure of riding a bike. But when that started circulating in the public sphere again, after it did in the 1970s as well, but it sort of reemerged 15 years ago or so, it struck me that here I am, a scholar of green movements. I'm intrigued by that connection between the bicycle and sustainability, and why is it that cities right now are prioritizing bicycles. And so that it's led me to do field work, ethnographic field work, in all kind of lots of interesting places. Lately, Bogota, Colombia. Been riding around that big, dangerous city with bike riders and bike activists, and trying to understand how they're trying to get the bike on the city's sustainability agenda. So in the process of a lot of that research, I decided to write this book, Reconsidering the Bicycle, an Anthropological Perspective on a New Old Thing. And the opportunity to do field work in Burlington, where I live, seemed especially ripe to me. And so I did, in preparation for writing this book, I did about 8 or 9 months of field work among bike riders, bike activists, and meanwhile I'm also a bike advocate in Burlington, worked with Local Motion for a long time and various other initiatives in the area. In doing that field work about the current moment, I knew in the background that there had been a bicycle boom in the 1890s that was part of our history, and I wanted to better understand what relevance that might have had for introducing the bicycle to Burlington. At the time when I was doing this research, there wasn't even a good history of Burlington. It's since come out. There's a wonderful sort of overview of Burlington's history, but of course it says nothing about transportation issues, or it says very little about transportation issues and nothing about bicycles. What that led me to was diving into the UVM Special Collections archive, where I started looking at city directories and newspaper collections and letters and photo collections and Sanborn fire maps, which are these old maps of the ways cities, where the water systems were, so firemen could sort of figure out where to get water if there were big fires. A whole slew of historical materials, and what I found was this untapped mountain that no one had any knowledge existed, that revealed interesting stories about Burlington's bicycle history. So some of that went into my book to give some of that background. And then I thought, wow, there's even more here. And so I developed a bicycle history bike tour of Burlington, which I've done maybe half a dozen times. Ride around Burlington for a few hours, and I pull out photos and talk about things, and it's really a lot of fun. But there's still more, and then so what's happened over the last maybe 3 or 4 years is my research has expanded to the whole of Vermont, and I'm really beginning to understand the different corners of this state and how they intersected with the bicycle. You know, I'm a bike nut. I got to say that from the outset. But you really don't need to be a bike nut to find this material fascinating, because the bicycle is an interesting lens into a period of real upheaval and transformation in American life. And the bike was a protagonist in some of that, and it was the effects of the bicycle we see reflected even today. So what we know, or at least what I know, is that the first bicycles began to arrive in Vermont in the late 1860s. And we know that because the St. Albans Messenger in 1869 advertised a velocipede riding school. No one knew how to ride these things, and so skating rinks were being converted to riding rinks. And St. Albans wasn't the only place where this happened. It happened in Burlington and various other cities and towns. Rutland had one. These probably, so if you don't know what these bikes look like, if you just pick up that yellow thing, there's a little field guide to old bicycles. And these bikes were what we know of as bone shakers informally. They were 2 wagon wheels with a piece of wood connected and the pedals on the front wheels. They were sort of the second generation of early bicycles. The very first generation were really running machines. They didn't have pedals, but in the early 1860s, one of these old running machines ended up in a Paris wagon wheel shop for repairs, and a young enterprising mechanic there. Some people think it was a guy named Pierre Lallemand. There's historical debate. Decided to mess around, and he put cranks and pedals on that front wheel. And it caught on very quickly, and so that shop, the Michaud brothers shop, picked up a new business of making these things. And they became popular by the end of the decade in New York and the United States. And they were circus acts. And that's, my guess, is the first bicycles that Vermonters would have experienced probably came here as a circus act on a bone shaker. And bone shakers were really heavy, 150 pounds. They were called bone shakers because you would rattle all over riding them. But a decade later, we see the ordinaries, the penny farthings, the high wheelers increasing in number. And these things really didn't come to the United States until the 1875, 1876. So already 3 years later, people in Vermont are getting these things. These were very expensive, 6 months' wages. Frank Gurley here from Barrie, his bike just surfaced after a very long time, and a friend of mine just bought it. So it's up in Burlington now. The way you organize this was into fraternal organizations called Wheelmen's clubs. And so Wheelmen's clubs were organized in a kind of military fashion. They wore uniforms, they had buglers, they had sergeants and captains and the like. and they rode around like cavalry units. They did a lot of parading. They raised a huge amount of enthusiasm here in Vermont as they would ride through the countryside and show up to specific towns during parades and the like. In the 1880s, these bikes became more and more popular, and wheelmen's clubs really started popping up all over the state. By the 1890s, the cost of the bicycle had dropped because of bicycles' industrialization. So the middle classes and the working classes were increasingly getting access to them. Women started taking to the wheel as the bicycle became safer. And so, as this gentleman was saying, the problem with those big ordinaries was that you would just literally just go over the front, and that term header came about because of that. And lots of delicious historical ironies about the inventors of those kinds of bicycles shooting over the front and killing themselves or getting maimed and injured. So what came after that was the safety bicycle, the bicycle that the first safety bicycle was the Rover. It was 1886, 1885. And very quickly it stabilized with pneumatic tires, which were invented to make that a smoother ride. And by the early 1890s, we have a lot of people enthusiastically taking to the wheel. And wheelmen are fighting hard to improve road conditions and having a fair amount of success with that. Advertisers, or I should say retailers, hopped in on this craze of selling bicycles, and retailers of all kinds. And so in Burlington, for example, in the 1890s, we had 10 bicycle retailers. And this is a city at the time of about 19,000 people. Today we have 43,000, and we have 5 bicycle retailers. And so there was this period of the first bicycle boom, is what we call it, in the 1890s, was a time of tremendous excitement around the bicycle. And everyone was getting in on the act. George Hager's hardware store, they sold harness trimmings, as well as Victor and Newmail bicycles. There was a dedicated bike shop, Lane's Bicycle Livery, in town, and they rented bicycles. They would do a short-term rental for visitors, or they would do long-term rentals for a month or two at a time, as well as selling new bikes and used bikes. The jeweler got in on the business, selling diamonds, watches, as well as optical goods and bicycles. And then the electrical supply store had a bicycle department. And so everyone was getting in on the act, and there was this sense that there was a bicycle mania in the 1890s. And this is a famous cartoon from 1897, "The latest disease, bicycle mania, we all have it." And people were really reimagining their lives and the world through the bicycle. And so this sort of captures some of that and satirizes it at the same time. Bicycle cigars, bicycle complexion powders, bicycle National Bank, eat bicycle food, buy the roulette wheel, drink bicycle soda, cures bicyclist diseases. There was a whole, you'll hear about this as I go later, there was a whole slew of new diseases that were emerging to address and treat maladies associated with bicycling. So this mania was, really a huge part of American life, and but by 1899, the turn of the century, 1900, you're starting to see that's the peak, and then by 1910, and certainly by 1920, the end of the period of my talk, the bicycle is in decline as the focus of excitement, as the automobile begins to emerge, and people are looking to that for recreation and transportation excitement. It's not that everyone had it. In fact, in Vermont, as late as 1915, there were only several dozen cars registered in the whole state. But that was where a lot of the excitement was shifting. So as popular enthusiasm dips, though, the thing I want to sort of say today is that, or one of the things is that this was not simply a fad. It was not something that was a sort of flash in the pan. I think that it's associated, this period is associated with some more consequential and durable changes, some things that we take for granted today. One of the ones that I'm really fascinated by is that period ushered in new ideas about the pleasures of being automobile. That experience of being able to direct yourself wherever you want to go and using your own, power to get there. And people hadn't really had that experience up to that point. Of course, they had trains which could go fast, but they were thought to swallow people with their schedules and their heavy technology and so on. You weren't on your own terms. And of course there were horses and buggies and so on, but a horse would get tired and so on. So one of the things that people thought of the bicycle, they called it an iron horse because it sort of had the ability to transport you all kinds of places, but it didn't have some of the weaknesses of the horse. So people got really excited about this experience of effortless speed, that wind sort of rushing through your hair, that pulsating legs, that there was a sort of close association between the bicycle and healthfulness. But these are all things we kind of take for granted today, that we can just get in our car and go on the open road and direct where we want to go. Another thing is that this was a cutting-edge industry. The bicycle industry was, it was born here in New England, in Hartford, Connecticut, and up to sort of, well, the Connecticut River Valley, really, up to Chicopee, Massachusetts, Boston. And the bicycle industry was at the cutting edge of fine precision manufacturing. They started in sewing machine factories, and some very consequential industrial techniques were developed in bike factories. For example, the ability to bend tubing, to make seamless tubing and bend it. Ball bearings were very much refined. And it laid the industrial groundwork for the rise of the automobile, as well as the technological groundwork. So I'm always amazed to think about this situation, that in the Columbia Bicycle Factory, Columbia was the sort of biggest bicycle company, the most important in the US. It was in Hartford. A young Henry Ford went there when he was a bike mechanic, and on a formal visit to the factory that a lot of bike mechanics would go on. And he was really blown away by what he saw there, which was production in an assembly line fashion on an electrified 24/7 production schedule that Thomas Edison had helped develop, and a conveyor belt that was sort of moving pieces along, and then workers would assemble parts and so on. And you got to wonder how much of that inspired him to develop the system of production that he ultimately did in the Ford Motor Company. But even Columbia Bicycle Company by the 1890s was already imagining a different future of developing cars and selling cars. And so the other thing is that it sort of laid this network of repair facilities, this bike repairmen all over the US that eventually became gas stations and automobile repair people. And it's not lost on a lot of us that the airplane industry was inspired very early on with Orville and Wilbur Wright, who were bike mechanics and were messing around. So this was an era of tinkering, and there were huge creativity at the edges of that industrial system that was emerging. And just one other interesting element of all this was that this was a very expensive object for much of this early history. So the bike industry didn't want to leave anything to chance, and they invested very heavily in novel advertising techniques, and they developed a lot of new advertising techniques. And by the 1890s, about 10% of newspaper ads are bicycle ads, bicycle-related ads. And that allows the media, the newspapers of the time, to shift from subscriber-driven newspapers to now advertising-driven newspapers. So the bike industry played a really consequential role in that period. There was also, we'll get into this in a little bit, reordering of gender relations as women are taking to the wheel, and early on they're really assertive about the restrictive clothing they have to wear, and then later they connect the bicycle to claims for rights. And the bike was involved in all kinds of new ideas about how you spend your leisure time, where you should go for your leisure activities, mode of escape from big cities especially, and new ideas about athleticism and the importance of a sort of a healthy lifestyle. So they also caused a lot of commotion and a lot of consternation and social conflict, especially in cities as cyclists were using their bikes in ways that were very disruptive to pedestrians and urban propriety of the time. And so traffic laws were actually invented in this period to manage bicycle riders. And bikes were drawn into debates about the effects of urban living on people that was still pretty new for a lot of Americans. And so religious leaders came out very heartily against the bicycle because people would rather spend their Sundays, like today, on a bike ride instead of going to church. And there's at least one example I know of in Indiana of a pastor who said, well, if I can't beat him, I'll join him. And so he offered ride-in services on Sundays. And health authorities, as I said here, Cures Bicyclist Diseases, warned of all kinds of new maladies that were at the tip of the iceberg of a debate over what were the impacts of bicycling on people's bodies. So in this talk, I give us an overview of how did all this play out in Vermont. And I want to know, in my own work, who was riding a bike? Why were they riding bikes? Where would you get a bike? What were the roads like if you wanted to go on a bike ride? Who would you see out there? And I've organized the talk into these three categories: the wheelmen, the new woman, and good roads. And so that's sort of the structure of this talk. So, the wheelmen. Here's the Bicycle Club of Swanton from 1893. So until the turn of the century, the proper way to ride a bicycle was with your companions, people of your same social status, and you would join a wheelmen's club. This was a period of a lot of fraternal organizations in our society, and wheelmen's clubs were very important organizations in a lot of small towns in Vermont. And the high cost of the wheel early on, they called these things the wheel sometimes, meant that at least in the 1880s, this was the realm of very wealthy elite men. And by the 1890s, it starts getting into the middle classes, the clerks, the sort of lower level merchants, and so on. Not everybody's allowed into a wheelman's club, as you'll see in a little bit. But the most prominent wheel club in Vermont was the Vermont Wheel Club from Brattleboro. It was actually founded in 1880 as the Brattleboro Cycle Club. The second founded in the U.S. The first was the Boston Cycle Club, at least local clubs. And it lasted until 1924. It was a very important organization, not just in Brattleboro, but throughout the state. You didn't have to have a bicycle to join, in fact. You had to be an upstanding gentleman citizen of the area. They held a winter ball every year that if you were an aspiring politician in Vermont, you found your way down to their winter ball, because that was where you met all of the consequential business leaders of southern Vermont. And they had a house, a building built for them. So the wheelmen's clubs would often use clubhouse spaces to host visiting wheelmen. And Vermont was kind of between New York City, Boston, and Montreal, which were all big centers of wheeling. And so the early wheelmen would go on long rides, and they would go on tours, and they would stop at these wheel clubs and sort of be hosted and feted for an evening and have a nice bed to sleep on, and then move on the next day. And in Brattleboro, in the market block, the building still stands. It's no longer, there's no evidence that it was a wheelman's club. But they had very finely appointed sort of rooms in there. In Burlington, which is a club I know a fair amount about, this is the shot of them in 1886, more or less, in front of the Fletcher Free Library. The gentlemen along here, with a few young men thrown in, are among Burlington's most prominent citizens, publisher of newspaper, the lawyers and doctors and the like. And one of the things about being in a wheel club, especially in the 1880s, that set you apart was two things, really. It was the price of a wheel, 6 months' wages. It meant that it was only accessible to the most wealthy men, and so this was a status symbol to have a bike. The other thing was that mastering that thing was exceedingly hard. And so people really valued the kind of sportiness that came along with that ability to master one of these things. So this was a way that you sort of showed yourself as above the rabble, was to be in a wheel club like this. What's interesting about the Burlington Wheel Club is that by 1888, so just 2 years after this photo, they all abandoned their bicycles and they get yachts, because yachts, the Champlain Yacht Club was founded in that year. And you sort of look at the roles of the Burlington Wheel Club then, and then you look at the roles of the Champlain Yacht Club. It's basically the same people. They just took their status elsewhere. But in Brattleboro, the Vermont Wheel Club remains the prominent social organization in that town for a very long time. And in the state of Vermont as well, the Vermont Wheel Club had real prestige as an important organization. This is a fairly typical wheelman of the 1880s. This is Joseph Auld. He was the publisher of the Burlington Weekly Free Press and various other newspapers. There were like 9 newspapers in Burlington in this period, which is incredible. But he actually got a patent from the United States government in 1883 for a tricycle gearing system, which never seems to have gone into production. But this is a tinkerer. He was a kind of a Renaissance man who was as interested in mechanical matters as he was in literary. And later in the 1890s, he developed this book, Picturesque Burlington, which came out in several editions. And it's photographs that he took and then descriptions of the beautiful drives that he would go on, which were by bicycle, right? So he developed this book and its views of Burlington by riding around the area and with a camera and taking pictures and so on. There was a very close association between bicycle riding and early camera technology. And there were cameras that were sold specifically to wheelmen, that were meant to sit on your handlebars and so on, and there would be special bags and all that. So Joseph Auld was into bicycles for a while, and then he got a yacht and joined the Champlain Yacht Club. In Rutland, they also founded one of the very first wheelmen's clubs in Vermont. In 1881 is when their club was founded. By 1886 or so, they more or less disappeared. And there's this really interesting story. So they decided to build a whole new skating rink for the city of Rutland. And they opened it with a lot of fanfare on July 4th, 1884. It cost them $15,000. It was a big investment. This thing had 1,200 seats, 900 seats on the bottom, about 300 on the top. Numerous chandeliers with 30 gas jets. But what's interesting is in 1885, just a year later, it sold for $2,325. And so the story there is that I saw it referred to in one document as that skating rink fiasco, and what it was these guys wanted a place to ride their wheels, and they thought that the way they would pay for that would be to attract skating, roller skating, and the roller skaters really didn't show up, and so it turned out to be a big egg for them, and the enthusiasm for wheeling in Rutland began to sort of diminish, so that by the end of the 1880s, you really don't have evidence of this being a big wheeling center. I think a lot of these guys were pretty disillusioned. Here they are in 1885 on a trip to Springfield, Massachusetts, posing smartly with all their ribbons and such. Down the road at Bellows Falls, sort of within that sphere of influence of Brattleboro, there was a wheelmen's club, the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club, which was really quite important for that small town. They had dozens of members, and this is an interesting example of what did wheelmen do besides ride bicycles. They were very important social institutions. So the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club would sponsor comic operas and plays, and they had concerts and balls, ladies' night, and they did mock trials. The president of this club was a lawyer, a prominent lawyer. He had gone to Dartmouth and settled in Bellows Falls, and so he would put on these mock trials fairly regularly. And as it was described, aside from the rare fun of the occasion, the entertainment will be exceedingly interesting to ladies and others who have never attended a real trial. This one is just an ad from 1894 that describes one upcoming, and it involves a trial about the larceny of the Plymouth Rock rooster. And they wanted to show how a trial would actually look. Enthusiasm for wheeling is naturally quite high in this area. Here is some Woodstock wheelmen in the late 1880s. And in the St. Albans Messenger in 1886, there's a little piece here. The Vermont Bicycle advises wheelmen to visit Woodstock, where they will strike some of the best roads in the state. But that is just what bicyclists don't want to do, strike the roads. It hurts so. The Vermont Bicycle was a very short-lived effort of the Herald and News, which is from West Randolph, to make a newspaper for wheelmen. And I've largely only seen references to it. I haven't found any cache of the original, but Historical Society folks take note. We're keeping our eyes open for the Vermont Bicycle. Some random facts and figures. By the 1890s, bicycling is pretty popular here in town. Population of roughly 2,500. There were 8 bicycle agencies here. So I heard the question earlier, was there a bicycle shop here in the early 1900s? There probably was at least one. There were 8 agencies. It doesn't mean they had shops, but they were men who had signed contracts with all the major bike companies to sell bikes here. And there was a club, the Wabeno Cycle Club. Have you ever heard of the Wabeno Cycle Club? There's little bits and pieces of the Wabeno Club in the newspaper records. This is just an ad for a local. The F.H. Gillingham was one of the prestigious dealers around here because he sold Columbia, which was the sort of the most prestigious bike you could get one of the most that you could get at the time. And it was interesting, to be a dealer for Columbia was a tricky business because Columbia would not allow discounts. So at the end of the season, all your competitors were selling their bikes by discount to get them off the floors. But Columbia never allowed that. They wanted to preserve value in the bike. And so Columbia dealers didn't always last too long. It was a tough business, even though they were very good bicycles and so on. Here we are in 1895-ish, this parade here, just on Elm Street where we are, the wood photo here. This, I was just mentioning, this photo here was redone in, it must have been 1995. Do you guys have a copy of it? There was a Wheelman's, so there's a modern organization called the Wheelmen, and they held a meet here in 1995. and they took a reproduction picture of this, which I have, which I'm happy to share. And a friend of mine, Glenn Ames, up in Burlington, was present for that with one of his high-wheelers, and we'll talk your ear off about what fun it was. But plenty of clubs nearby here. The Upper Valley was a big area for wheelmen. Hartford, White River Junction, Lebanon, Claremont, Windsor, Hanover, Dartmouth had a wheelmen's club in the 1880s and 90s, and they paraded a lot, and a parade could draw up to 500 people, 500 wheelmen. And this is a very interesting little tidbit from 1895, the Herald and News in West Randolph, that describes a bicycle parade at Woodstock. A bicycle meet and parade under the auspices of the Wabino Cycle Club was held at Woodstock last Friday afternoon and evening, and was a brilliant and successful affair. Stores and residences were elaborately decorated, and in the evening the entire village was beautifully illuminated by over 3,000 Japanese lanterns. The Hartford and Lebanon cycle clubs and cyclists from adjoining towns were present. The Woodstock Railway Company running a special tram. About 200 wheels were in line, and the parade was witnessed by several thousand people. There was a fine display of fireworks in the evening. Woodstock Cornet Band, discoursed music, and refreshments were served to all cyclists and visiting friends in the town hall. This is the kind of news you get in the 1890s often about wheelmen's clubs, just organizing parades. And interestingly enough, this little tidbit here about the Woodstock Railway running wheelmen into town, one of the big advocacy concerns of these wheelmen was to get access to trains so that they could go to other towns to parade. And so they put a lot of pressure on the railway companies to allow them to bring their bikes on and to get special discounts. And I kind of laughed because we just won, a pilot project from Amtrak a couple of years ago to get our bikes on Amtrak. That took a lot of advocacy effort. And so they were thinking about this well before we ever thought about it. And they worked hard to get access to the trains. Woodstock has another little tidbit. You probably all know more about this than I do, but this is the story of H.B. Smith. So this is just a picture from James Murdoch's house here on North Park, sometime around 1900. Pretty unremarkable until you focus on that. And that in the background is the Star Bicycle. And the Star Bicycle was the bicycle between 1880 and 1884. And as you can see, it's a very funky thing. It's small wheel up front as opposed to the big wheel up front, and this was obviously a safer arrangement. It was a kind of a transition bike between the ordinary high wheeler and then the safety bicycle. And this was truly the bike to have in that short period. And the first bicycle, by the way, to ever go down Mount Washington was one of these Star bicycles. It was ridden by a guy named Hazlitt. They played bike polo on these things. They set speed records. And what's interesting is that this is not a pedal crank system. This is almost like those exercise machines that you can sort of step up and down, or step sort of like this. It was a kind of a stepping thing that ran a cog system in there. The connections to Woodstock are interesting. But I'll get to those in a sec. So. There was a song. Does anyone know about the song? If anyone knows how to play piano, you can get this music still on if you Google it. The Star Rider song. And here's John Stout, who was kind of the Tiger Woods of his era. He was a very well-known celebrity athlete who was deaf and mute, but did all kinds of special tricks on his Star Rider. Here he is riding on the Michigan State Capitol steps, one-handed. So it's something about his ability as well as the stability of that bicycle. But the connection to Woodstock here is that H.B. Smith Machine Company. H.B. Smith was born here in Woodstock, lived here until his early 20s, and developed a company to make manufacturing equipment for sort of wood manufacturing. He bought a town, as we know, in Burlington County, New Jersey, renamed it Smithville, and developed his sort of industrial factory there, when the designer of the Star bicycle showed up one day and asked Mr. Smith if he could produce that bicycle, and Mr. Smith saw a business opportunity, and so he jumped on it and produced those bicycles for a number of years. Apparently it was not a happy marriage. It was not a happy business marriage. There's a, I don't know, you must have the book in your collections. There's a book about H.B. Smith and Smithville and so on, which is where these books come from. Smithville, The Result of Enterprise. There were a few bicycles actually made in Vermont. Not many, but the Bennington Bicycle Company made a couple of bikes. This one here, the Tiffany Special, as well as the Nelson Special. Actually, there is a Tiffany Special available for $399 on eBay at the moment. I'm sure some enterprising Vermonter will be on that once everyone realizes that it's there. But here's the head badge of the Tiffany Special, made from the Bennington Bicycle Company. The Coolidge Cycle Company in Rutland made two bikes, the Vermont and the Rutland. They eventually shifted to cars and became a machine shop for cars. And then G.H. Payne up in St. Johnsbury had developed a business of what he called a bicycle hospital. And out of that he was producing a brand of bikes. So some bikes, not many. Wheelmen, sort of back to the story of the Wheelmen. The Wheelmen in their organizations, one of the things they did was they promoted orderly riding. Because remember, they organized riding in a very straight fashion. They were trying to develop a kind of an etiquette and protocol for bicycling. So here's a little tidbit from the Burlington Free Press in 1895. Always keep to the right, always keep your wheel clean. In passing another rider or vehicle, keep to the right. Keep off crowded streets unless you have urgent business there. Don't forget that pedestrians have rights. It often saves bitter thoughts. And cycling etiquette was an important concern, and you see it a lot in the newspapers in this period. Here's a little tidbit from the United Opinion in Bradford, 1895. I'll read the whole thing. Every sport has its rules of etiquette, and a system of exchange of courtesies must be adapted to cycling conditions. A question that is causing a great deal of agitation relates to the mode of greeting among wheelmen and wheelwomen. Shall a man take his hand from the handlebar at the risk of taking a header in order to tip his cap? Or shall he merely nod his head and say howdy? Shall a lady make a sweeping courtesy or merely nod? Instances are cited wherein men have tried to do that which they have been taught from childhood, and the result has been a hectic flush all over one side of their faces where their skin was caressed by the loving but somewhat calloused hand of Mother Earth. Ladies who have bowed too profoundly have been picked up tenderly by helping hands after it was all over. It is with reason, therefore, that cyclists are giving this matter serious consideration. So they were developing new norms about how to interact with each other with these newfangled objects. And as I said earlier, they were causing a lot of disruption in cities and towns where wheelmen were scaring pedestrians and horses and so on. Wheelmen were also really into racing. They organized races a ton, often on horse tracks. Here we are in Wright River Junction at Billings Park, the Vermont-New Hampshire Interstate Fair, August 1895. Big famous race, that one. But here's a little fun one from the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club in 1897. They organized a race from Bellows Falls to Claremont and back, sponsored by the club. And then I like what this says: a good share of the village showed up accidentally. And it was about 40 miles round trip, and the winner came back in 2 hours and 9 minutes, which averages out to about 20 miles per hour, which is pretty fast. If you can imagine the condition of roads and the hills and so on, that is moving at a good clip. And it caused mishaps. Here's a fun little tidbit at the bottom. When at the top of Dean Hill, about 5 miles this side of Claremont, on the return trip, Henry Grignon broke the rim to one of his wheels and rode 2 miles farther before meeting his cousin, with whom he exchanged wheels. He then rode on to Charlestown, where he secured another mount and arrived third in the race in spite of the mishap. The feats of athleticism on bicycle were really remarkable. And this is in the late 1890s, but people, and not too back far in their minds, were the feats of people like Thomas Stevens, who rode the first high-wheel bicycle around the world in the early 1884, 1885, and sent back reports that were published widely about his adventures by bicycle. And so people were really amazed at what you could do with bicycles and wanted to test how fast you could go and how far you could go. And here's just a local one. Two crack Woodstock wheelmen, Irving Ransom and Max Mass. So they left here, Woodstock, at 2:30 a.m. They rode 83 miles to Littleton, New Hampshire. They got there and they were going to turn back, but then they decided to keep going on to Woodsville. They stopped in St. Johnsbury, and by the end of the day, basically, they'd ridden 158 miles in 23 hours. They took a short rest, and then they rode another 52 miles home. So this was newsworthy. This was important news because this was quite a feat here. People were really pushing their bodies in ways that were new and exciting. But Scorching was a real menace as well, and so if there was the other of the wheelmen, it was the Scorcher. And the newspapers in Vermont are full of stories of scorchers in the 1890s. And this is the one from Burlington in 1899. It took place right here in front of this shop. It was Frank Lane's bicycle livery. Today it's in the student part of town, and it's just a student house, and so there's just cars parked there. And nobody who lives there has any sense that this was once Burlington's longest running bike shop. It was there about 30 years or so. Moved eventually into selling motorcycles, and he was an Indian motorcycle dealer for a while in the 20s. But it describes a situation here. Another accident occurred Tuesday evening as a direct result of the ever-present bicycle scorcher. I just love how that opens up. The ever-present bicycle scorcher. People were really concerned about this. And when it describes that a guy named Abner Lozo, who was a mechanic at this shop, was scorching down Loomis Street. He ran over Barney Buxton, a boy of about 8 or 9 years old. He lay unconscious, cut on one side of the boy's head, right arm seriously bruised. They called Dr. Lyman. The lad regained consciousness but was not able to remember anything about the accident. So these kinds of stories are pretty persistent as people were adjusting to the presence of bicycles in cities. And this kind of story still plays out in a city like Burlington. There's this same year, I've clipped a little article that says, UVM freshman was racing down Pearl Street and hit a pedestrian. And I'm pretty much sure that happens every year with a UVM freshman hitting a pedestrian on Pearl Street. So, I'm sorry, yeah.
Good question. Was there any correlation to like early personal injury lawyers?
Well, yeah. If you look at the court cases in Burlington, there were a lot of court cases around bicycles and what we today might call bicycle aggression or something like that, where people were being fined, they were being thrown in jail for a couple of days for hitting pedestrians. Sort of, this is right in line with what I want to talk about, which is the legalities of this. So all this scorching got people thinking about, well, how do we manage this and control this? And so Wheelmen thought it would be best to get out on front on this issue, and this is from Bellows Falls in 1897. And the Bellows Falls, the Mount Kilburn Wheel Club published this. There has been considerable complaint of fast and reckless riding. It is better that the wheelmen take the matter in hand themselves. We suggest all wheelmen carry lanterns and bells and keep to the right side of the street or on such bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided. So 1897 was the year that all throughout the state of Vermont, towns started developing bicycle ordinances. And in Burlington, our bicycle ordinance today is not at all dissimilar to the bicycle ordinance they developed in 1897. You need to have lights front and rear to put on at dark. You need to have a bell. That's not in our ordinance today, but you're meant to communicate with others. There's a speed limit put in for cyclists in downtown. And then also, one of the things we still have today is Burlington has what's known as the inner fire district, which are the sidewalks downtown. And there was no riding on sidewalks in the inner fire district, which is still today the case. So I wouldn't be surprised if Woodstock in around this time, 1897 or so, developed an ordinance. So these are the first real traffic laws that come about. The other little tidbit that I find really interesting here is this statement, "On such bicycle paths as may hereafter be provided." This was the middle of a period in American history where city and town leaders and the broader population were imagining a future transportation system in which bicycles were going to be a major protagonist. And so they started developing pathways, side paths on the sides of roads. Up in St. Johnsbury, they organized in that same year to build a side path to a couple of neighboring towns. And they did it very, very quickly because there was so much enthusiasm to get flow between the towns. And the side path movement, there were tens of thousands of miles of side paths that were developed. And so they were imagining a future where that's how you got from town to town, is by paths. And then by the end of the 1890s, that period just sort of disappeared. And they were basically toll roads. You bought a toll, or you bought a little tag to put on your bicycle that allowed you to ride on a specific section. And the wheelmen's clubs would control those pathways. There were other legal matters. This is a little excerpt from the Bellows Falls Time in 1896. "It is next to impossible to safely steal a bicycle in Vermont." Yeah, sure. Here's a story about a court case here in Windsor County. George Ash, a bicycle thief, had stolen a bike. He got it in White River Junction. He claims it was from a college student who gave it to him. Sure. And he brought it up to Chittenden County and sold it there. The value of the bicycle then was $7, about $190 in today's money. And he was found guilty and thrown into jail for 3 months, which says something about the value, right? Not just the cost, but the value that people placed on bicycles. These were still very prestigious items in the late 1890s. And so there were real consequences for people who stole bicycles. Now, what about the new woman? This is from the Londonderry Sifter in 1897. He, "Don't you think it rather risky to come so far alone on your wheel?" She, "Hadn't thought of it, but if you feel timid, I will see you home." So, in the 1890s, women are taking to the wheel in big numbers, and it's provoking a huge public debate about women with immodest attire, riding unchaperoned through the streets of our cities and towns, to which the prominent women's rights advocate Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "The bicycle will inspire women with more courage, self-respect, and self-reliance, and will make the next generation more vigorous of mind and body, for feeble mothers do not produce great statesmen, scientists, and scholars." The early years of women's interest in bicycles was really focused on the clothing, the restrictive clothing that women were expected to wear. And in the 1880s, there was a movement called the rational clothing movement that was beginning to emerge to challenge those clothes. And when the bicycle came about, a lot of new women joined that cause, that idea that, you know, we should be able to not be tied in by these whalebone corsets and such. So the bloomer was invented for the purposes of modest bicycle riding by women. There were very close symbolic and political ties between the bicycle and the suffrage movement that was beginning to really gain steam in the 1890s. But so the newspapers are full of references and considerations and debates over women's riding of bicycles. This is from 1895 in the Burlington Free Press. "The coming woman will be the woman whose mother rode a bicycle and thereby made herself fit to be the mother of the coming woman," says Ida Trafford Bell. "There are 8 million bachelors in the United States. Watch the reduction in number as soon as the bicycle girl in bloomers is scattered over the land," says the American Wheelman. And it raised some interesting questions about this growing interaction between men and women on bikes. And here's one little news item, again from the Free Press in 1895, about selecting a cycle teacher, as people are trying to figure out what is this new proximity between men and women. So, "Most cycle depots will send up a man to teach any of their own customers, and many ladies have learned in the fashion. Personally, however, it seems to me that if one must clutch any male thing wildly by the neck and fall into his arms 10 or 20 times in the course of an afternoon, a relative or intimate friend is better than an unknown oily mechanic. For I should therefore counsel any girl who contemplates learning the safety to select her teacher with these unavoidable contingencies in full view." So they're trying to work through what does it mean to have all these women learning wheeling and so on. And here in Vermont, there was a Congress really, on the rights of suffrage and the enfranchisement of women in 1892. And largely what this was about, at least in the way it was being framed for Vermont's women, was around the right to a new body. And so that notion of a new woman that was circulating at the time was this was a woman who had control over her body, who could get out there and exercise. And so on page 1, there's this whole thing about the right of physical training, that women can get outside, they can breathe fresh air, they can exercise, they can liberate their bodies from the kinds of clothing and physical drudgeries of that they were really tied down to. So the bike industry responded very positively to this. The bicycle industry very quickly started producing products and accessories and bikes just for women. So, it's not just the step-through bicycle frame, but special seats. Actually, I have a few cartoons in the back, and please feel free to take them. But there was one very famous bicycle seat that was created specifically for women, and the Christie bicycle seat that sold very, very well because it was thought to protect women's perineums. And so the bike industry was very quick to say, yes, we support this because it's a chance for us to sell more goods and accessories and so on. So there were special bicycle pedals for women, special bicycle boots, skirts, you sort of name it. But here in Vermont, the enthusiasm among women for wheeling was a bit more complicated than a kind of triumphalist narrative of suffrage and so on. This little bit from the Orleans County Monitor in 1895. "Miss May June, do you believe in women's suffrage?" Miss Jan Feb, "Well, I haven't quite come to that yet, but I ride a bicycle." So women here in Vermont weren't as quick to sort of say that their riding a bicycle is a statement of suffrage, their rights. They enjoyed the experience, but through the lens and the prism of Vermont women, they had already gained municipal suffrage in this state in the 1870s, and so that they could already serve on school boards and the like. So women were politically active here in the state, formally speaking. So in contrast to other states like New York or Massachusetts, where the suffrage movement was much stronger, here in Vermont, women were a little more standoffish. It's not that it wasn't irrelevant here, but women had the right to divorce in Vermont. There was a high literacy rate. The 1890s was a period of growing tourism, and it was often women who were the ones managing the economics of that as visitors are coming to the farm to stay. But very prominent women, including the Wells ladies here in Burlington. If you've ever heard of Payne's Celery Compound, which was this very, very famous global product made in Vermont. It was a sort of a catch-all, will solve everything, snake oil kind of thing. They were heirs to that whole fortune, but they were not suffragettes by any stretch. But what really undergirded women's desires to ride bicycles was this health debate that was playing out in the public sphere about what are the positive and negative effects of bicycling. And for the most part, and by the way, this was called hygiene. This period is bicycling hygiene. And hygiene was this idea of sort of self-improvement through sanitary, kind of arrangements and exercise. And so bicycling hygiene was really important. And so in the newspapers, you see a lot of this kind of stuff. The best RX is a ride. Take it instead of going to the druggist. This article actually called Bicycle Hygiene, describing what bicycling does that's good for you. It opens up the pores, which should be treated with ablutions of water. You should know how to breathe. Breathing through the mouth can cause heart troubles. And be sure your mouth doesn't get parched. It can affect digestion. Drink milk with a few drops of rum in it before a ride. So for the most part, doctors came out in favor of bicycling. They thought it was a good thing for people to be out there exercising. But there were dark warnings as well. And this is a really interesting article called Bicycle Riding Denounced. And it describes a lecture by a guy named Dr. Heine Marks from the he was a former superintendent of the St. Louis Hospital. And he goes off on bicycling, and he has very dark warnings. He says, first, you have a kind of paralysis of the hands. That was known as bicycle hands. That was a disease that people were really worried about, where it was a progressive disease that would start with the sort of, well, as I have in one of my comics in that little pile over there, you hold on tight as you're a beginner, and if you keep holding on tight over time, eventually you develop a kind of palsy, and you can't control your hands, and then eventually you just can't control you're paralyzed. That was the thinking. And contraction of the chest. This causes congestion to the lungs and leads to consumption. Furthermore, with men, rupture, varicocele, hydrocele follow, and worst of all, it destroys virility. This was a big concern about bicycling, that it was destroying virility. With women, riding promotes amorous desires. Married women are especially liable to very serious mishaps. If the world is not depopulated by the rapidly increasing membership of this suicide club, the human race will die out by reason of lack of manhood and inability to propagate. So this was the sort of, the hyped up language that one sees a fair amount in the newspapers about bicycling. And it's not coincidental that a lot of these were targeted at women, right? Because women are out there asserting their determination to ride bicycles, and the male medical profession was really medicalizing that activity as a way to dissuade them. And so a very famous bicycle disorder of the time was called bicycle face. And bicycle face was the struggle of holding up a bicycle, and the result would be your face gets frozen in a contorted sort of manner, and your eyes bulge. And that was it was targeted at women. And women were told over and over again that you will be ugly because of bicycle face, so you should probably not ride a bicycle. And what about the roads? Part 3. So the roads were a mess, as you can see here, from 1894. The way we managed roads in this country up until this period was the adjacent landowner would take rocks and stones and whatever out of his property to make his fields, and throw them out, and eventually he might crush them a little bit, but for the most part they would just get packed down. Because of that system of decentralized control and management of roads, that basically landowners were responsible for it. Roads were very uneven and for the most part a mess, as you can imagine here in Vermont. So the road issue was a really consequential one for these people riding their bikes, because they didn't want to, get bogged down constantly. They were always concerned about great roads. And one of the reasons that Burlington, for example, became a very popular destination for wheelmen to ride was that in the 1870s, Burlington had bought a stone crusher and made these, what one article in the 1880s calls sandpapered streets. And so people loved to come to Burlington to ride their wheels because it was just a nice experience and they could go fast. And so the road problem was a really important one. In the early years, this is in 1887, this is a really interesting book. It's called 10,000 Miles on a Bicycle, written by a guy named Carl Crone. That was his pseudonym. His real name was Lyman Bagg. This book is available, actually, if you just sort of go to Google Books, and it's in the public sphere, and it's this enormous volume. And it's a really interesting picture and insight into how did people manage the road problem in the early years. And so what Bagg was up to was he rode around the New England and the Northeast and then the upper Midwest, rode 10,000 miles, and everywhere he'd stop, he would meet the wheelmen, and he would get advice from them about where should he ride, and then what roads were good, and then he would collect $5 from each of them, and they would be subscribers, and then at the end of his journey, he would write this all up, and he would send a copy to every subscriber. And at the back of this book, in fact, the bulk of this book is this appendix of all of these wheelmen who committed their $5. So there's probably people from Woodstock in there. I actually haven't looked, but there's people from all over Vermont who, pitched in their money to get this book. And here's his little one entry on Vermont. If you ever get asked when was the first century ride in Vermont, the answer is in this book. The longest day's ride previously taken in Vermont was on July 9th, 83, so 1883, by two Rutland boys, W. Eggleston and N.S. Marshall, 100.5 miles. Then he describes where he rode. He rode from Bellows Falls to Montpelier and Burlington. He rode to Windsor, went over to the New Hampshire side, et cetera, et cetera. So he rode through this area. He was on his way from White River Junction to Royalton, so I wouldn't be surprised if he came through here. Anyway, so this is what you got. This is how you knew where to go if you wanted to go far. Sorry, let me just go back over to here. So later what happened was they started developing maps, and so after the talk you can see this is the southern Vermont section of this map. This is from the 1890s. But this has, as you get up close, you'll see there's lots of red lines, and those are the suggested routes for the wheelmen traveling through the state of Vermont. And there's a route that comes right through here because this was obviously a place known for its wheeling activity and so on. And then that notion of a triptych that you get when you go to the AAA and you're going on a road trip. They give you this sort of plan. So wheelmen produced what were called road books, and you could buy a road book which would have sort of point-by-point directions of where to ride. Actually, last time I gave this talk was in Montpelier 2 weeks ago, and somebody brought the Northern New England Road Book from the late 1890s. And it's a remarkable thing. It has all the hotels that were, ads for the hotels that were where you should stay, and all the great rides to make. And so those road books were created by and marketed by the League of American Wheelmen. So the League of American Wheelmen still exists. It's called the League of American Bicyclists. It was founded in 1880. There was a meetup of wheelmen in Providence, Rhode Island. And they were complaining about the state of the roads and the state of the legal situation for bicyclists back then. And the legal situation was that bikes had been banned from places like Central Park in New York. And so the decision was taken to organize a national wheelmen's organization. Albert Pope, the founder of the Columbia Bicycle Company, was present. And he was very enthusiastic about this, so he bankrolled the organization. And one of the things that he insisted on was that the organization take on the road problem. And so in his company, they had a road department. And he went around the country making addresses about the problem of our roads. And so here he is, an eminent writer says, "The road is that physical sign or symbol by which you will best understand any age or people. If they have no roads, they are savages. For the road is the creation of man and the type of civilized society." I've read a lot, this was 1889. I've read a lot of these kinds of good roads conference presentations. There was one up at UVM, and the state geologist at the time was the invited guest speaker. He taught the first anthropology class in the country in the 1880s. That's one of our claims to fame up there. But it's the same guy. He was teaching archaeology, and he was also the state geologist. And he gave an address in which he more or less said the same thing, that good roads are a sign of civilization. And we can't believe that those Incas, those backward savages, had roads that are better than ours. So the rhetoric was very sort of hyped up about this. But one of the things that the Pope Manufacturing Company, Columbia Bicycles, did was they gave away 100 Columbia bicycles in an essay competition in order to get young people, this was targeted at college students and high school students, to write essays in favor of good roads. And so they were trying everything they could to get people's attention about how to improve roads. The notion of a protest ride was emerged at the time. This is a road just across the lake from us in Burlington, in Ausable Chasm in upstate, the Adirondacks, in the mid-1890s, with this sort of good roads frog. And so people were organizing rides to bring awareness to their concern for good roads. And in a state like Vermont, this was obviously a big concern to agriculturalists as well. And so we had a unique alliance that got created here in Vermont pretty early between the agricultural community and the wheelmen who came together to promote this good roads legislation and the Vermont Highway Act in 1892. So this is where Vermont fits into the good roads story in an interesting way. Ours is the first state to pass good roads legislation. And what it meant was centralized control over roads, and the ability to raise new property taxes, which would be distributed as aid back to towns. And then towns were authorized to issue bonds to build and improve roads. And it established a state highway commission. So this was in 1892. We were the first. And the guy at the time who was governor who saw this through was Levi Fuller. And Levi Fuller was from Brattleboro, the Vermont Wheel Club, right? And his father-in-law was the president of the Vermont Wheel Club. So those wheelmen were working very, very hard on political figures to get them to pass this legislation. And so Levi Fuller, when he was done being governor, was a national celebrity. He traveled all over the country, invited by local good roads leagues and good roads wheelmen groups to talk about how is it that you did it in Vermont. So we have that sort of interesting bit of our history. After 1900, we do start seeing a new vehicle making its appearance. The automobile starts muscling its way in. So here's a 1902, the Vermont Phoenix, which is from Brattleboro, is advertising the greatest event of the year, which is actually a 4th of July celebration in Burlington. And the 4th of July celebrations in Burlington for years were highlighted with the wheelmen, who would come from all over and ride by the hundreds. And here we go. We've got military, automobile, bicycle, horribles, and trade parades. So it's now, the bicycle is now being sort of pushed to the side as early as 1902. The only thing less prestigious is the horribles. You know what horribles are? Horribles are really interesting. It's this sort of New England phenomenon of people who address as prominent political figures and mock them. And they're sort of, in anthropology terms, it's like sacred clowning or ritual clowning, where like under certain circumstances, people can make fun of those in charge.
Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, well, that's our version of it, right? That's our horribles. I think we need to bring horribles back. Our parades these days need more horribles. But anyway, so in 1899, the first car climbs Mount Washington. A guy named F.O. Stanley did that. The Vermont Motor Company was established in 1902. Up in Burlington, Horatio Nelson Jackson made his famous bet to drive across country in 1903. Do you know that story? So Horatio Nelson Jackson was a young Burlington doctor. His father-in-law was William Wells, the hero of Gettysburg. He was a cavalry general. And they're a very prominent family. They were the ones who made Payne's celery compound. Anyway, so Horatio Nelson Jackson, Horatio had decided that he wasn't too interested in medicine anymore. He was kind of had a little bit of an early midlife crisis, and he went out to California, went to San Francisco, and he was hanging out with some buddies one night, and they were drinking, and somehow they got into a bet. Horatio bet his friends that he could drive a car across the country, and no one had attempted that. And so it was this very fraught expedition. But the next day he went out and bought a little red car and started his drive, and it took him several months, but he made it to New York City and won his bet. And at the Smithsonian now you can go see that car, and there's a whole exhibit around his journey. By 1905, the yacht is now competing with the automobile, right? So the Burlington Automobile Club is founded in 1905. In 1910, the Gentlemen's Driving Club is founded. So increasingly all that excitement that was associated with the bicycle is now being displaced by the automobile. And then as you go into the newspapers post-1910 all the way up to 1920, this kind of story dominates. The bikes versus cars story. And so, you know, stories about, here's one in Windsor, a boy who was knocked down. Lots of stories about boys and cars colliding. And it's a story of boys, right? Because at this point, the bicycle is no longer an adult thing, right? After 1910, the bike industry has maxed out demand among adults. And a lot of the bike there were like 3,000 bicycle brands in the United States in the 1890s. By 1910, it's really reduced. A lot of bike companies went out of business. And those that remained, like Schwinn and so on, really started targeting their marketing towards kids, and especially boys. And so the bike industry totally transforms in that period to being one that sells, you know, liberating toys for kids, for boys. And that, of course, lasts for much of the century until perhaps the present. But that old conflict is one that is quite present early on. So that is the substance of my talk. And I'm always looking for materials. This is how one of the ways I find materials is I come to small communities in Vermont and people say, oh yeah, you know what, I have some photos you might be interested in. So if you have anything or any leads, I'm always happy to take them.
Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.